I want you to think about the last time you had introduced yourself to a total stranger. Like really put yourself back in that exact moment.
Oh, yeah. That's always a stressful situation.
Right. So
Yeah.
maybe you were at a networking event or a dinner party. Was it just this robotic list of facts you rattled off, like your name, your profession, your city, or did it actually feel like a real, authentic reflection of who you are?
It is a notoriously difficult needle to thread. I mean, we all have this fundamental desire to be understood, to be truly seen.
Exactly.
But when we're put on the spot, the pressure often forces us to default to delivering pure data. We basically hand over our resume instead of our actual personality.
Yeah, and that tension between data and personality is exactly what we are looking at today. For this deep dive, we're pulling from a really fascinating set of sources. We have the transcripts from 2 highly comprehensive English language learning lessons.
Which are super detailed.
So detailed. One focuses entirely on the art of personal self-introductions, and the other tackles the language of health, routines, and fitness.
Which might sound like 2 entirely separate domains on the surface.
Right, totally different topics.
But when you look at the underlying mechanics, they are both fundamentally about how we articulate the human experience.
Yeah, and that is our mission today. We are going to uncover the fascinating mechanics of how we communicate our core identity. Because this isn't just about, memorizing grammar rules or syntax.
No.
It's about how the specific linguistic choices we make, from framing our daily routines to describing our habits at the gym, paint a vivid picture of who we are, how our physical bodies feel, and ultimately who we want to become. Okay, let's unpack this.
We have to start at the absolute foundation, which is establishing our presence in a given moment. The source material points out something immediately striking.
Which is?
Well, even the most basic statement of existence can sound incredibly unnatural if you aren't deploying the right social cues.
Oh, you mean the dreaded I am? Like, if you walk up to a stranger and say, I am David, you project this bizarre formal stiffness.
What's fascinating here is why that happens. It's robotic because native speakers naturally compress language for efficiency, but more importantly, they do it for warmth.
Warmth. Right?
Yeah. The shift from I am to I'm is, well, it's microscopic in terms of spelling, but socially it's massive. Saying I'm signals a casual readiness to connect. It basically strips away the formality that keeps people at a distance.
And it's like sketching a self-portrait.
Right.
Stating your name and age, that's just the broad pencil outline. But once you've established that baseline of warmth, you run right into geography. People always want to know where you're from.
They do. It's usually the first question.
But the sources highlight this necessary linguistic pivot for modern life.
Right.
Because so many of us, we just no longer live where we were born.
Right. The world is way more transient now.
Exactly. So instead of picking one place and just flattening your entire history, you use the pivot. You say, I'm originally from Egypt, but now I live in Germany.
That single word, originally, is doing an immense amount of conceptual heavy lifting. It acknowledges your roots while firmly planting you in your current reality.
Yeah.
In just one sentence, you aren't just stating a location, you are telling a miniature story of migration or ambition or change.
It compresses an autobiography into a handful of words. And we use that same kind of compression and nuance to soften our life situations too, especially the uncomfortable ones.
Oh, absolutely. The sources discuss how we mask unemployment, for example.
Right. Instead of the blunt, I am unemployed, the prescribed phrase is, I'm between jobs. But I kind of want to dig into that.
Sure, go for it.
We treat this as just polite vocabulary, but isn't it really about masking a gap in capitalist productivity?
I mean, that's precisely what it is. The phrase between jobs is basically an ideological shield.
An ideological shield, I like that.
Yeah, because it reframes a potentially stressful, vulnerable reality, which is having no income or professional identity into a temporary active transition. You aren't static. You are simply in the between space on an inevitable trajectory toward the next role.
It's like society demands that you signal you are still part of the economic machine, even when you aren't currently plugged into it.
Exactly. And speaking of timelines and trajectories, the most fascinating temporal trick in the sources is the use of the word yet.
Oh, the family question.
Right. If someone asks about family, saying, I don't have children, that's a closed door, it's definitive.
But appending yet to the end, like, I don't have children yet, it injects a whole different temporal reality.
It injects a future timeline right into a present tense conversation. By adding yet, you tell the listener that this is an active desire, something you are leaving space for in your life.
Wow.
It's a remarkably optimistic linguistic choice that entirely changes how the other person perceives your trajectory.
But then we get to actual personality traits, which is where the real vulnerability lies. The sources give this example for people who are naturally introverted. Instead of stating, I am shy, the phrase is, once I get to know someone, I open up.
Which is brilliant because it implies a process. It rewards the listener for their patience. It basically says, if you invest the time to make me comfortable, you will see my real personality.
But let me challenge that a bit. Is that actually vulnerability, or is it a calculated linguistic defense mechanism?
How do you mean?
Well, because when the sources suggest adding phrases like, to be honest, at the end of a sentence like, I'm not the most organized person, to be honest, that doesn't really feel like true vulnerability to me.
It doesn't.
No, it feels like manufactured humility to lower expectations. Like you're adding the shading and color to your self-portrait, but you're still completely in control of the brush.
You're touching on the strategy of conversation there. It absolutely is a defense mechanism, but an incredibly effective one. I mean, what's fascinating here is that conversation isn't just an exchange of raw data. It's about building rapport.
Right.
When you deploy a phrase like, to be honest, or you use a modifier like quite to soften a flaw, you are signaling self-awareness. You are intentionally stepping off a pedestal to stand on the exact same level as the person you were speaking to.
So it's a trade.
Yeah. You are offering them a minor, highly curated flaw, so they feel comfortable offering one in return. It's the social glue of human connection.
So we establish this carefully curated identity, full of warmth and strategic vulnerability and temporal hope. But an identity doesn't just exist in a vacuum, right?
No, it requires action.
Exactly. The way we introduce ourselves sets the stage, but what we actually do is the play itself.
Right. Yes, the rhythm of your life. How you spend your time either validates or contradicts the identity you just introduced. And linguistically, the engine driving this rhythm revolves around how we express frequency.
The adverbs.
Right. Words like always, usually, sometimes, rarely, and never. And the strict rule that they usually have to be placed before the main verb.
And the sources spend a lot of time on these adverbs, particularly in the context of daily routines. They lay out this idealized morning routine where, you wake up early, you always drink water, you usually go for a walk, you have green tea.
It's very idyllic.
It reads like a lifestyle influencer's script. But I have to push back on how these are used in reality. Are these adverbs of frequency actually more about personal time management than they are about grammar rules?
That's an interesting way to frame it.
I mean, think about the relatable reality. Pressing snooze 5 times. When you tell a coworker you always meal prep on Sundays or you rarely eat fast food, who are you actually trying to convince? It feels less like communication and more like a public audit of our value system.
That's a crucial distinction to make. Language inevitably broadcasts our priorities, and often it broadcasts our aspirations, masquerading as realities.
Masquerading as realities. Wow.
Yeah, because when you deploy always or never, you are drawing hard boundaries around your moral and physical discipline. You are broadcasting to the world and to yourself really how you prioritize your well-being. It's highly performative.
And we see that boundary setting even more clearly in how we discuss what we don't do. The sources dedicate significant time to the polite decline.
Oh, this is a big one.
Like if someone asks if you want to join a football league, bluntly saying I hate sports is abrasive. It creates a sudden uncomfortable wall.
It shuts down the social momentum completely.
So instead, the sources teach these casual softeners. You say, I'm not really into sports, or it's not really my thing. But again, I don't think this is just about avoiding offense, is it?
No, it's a highly sophisticated community filtering mechanism.
Community filtering.
Yeah. Saying it's not my thing is a gentle deflection that avoids attacking the other person's interests, but it firmly removes you from that specific rhythm. By softly declining the activities that contradict your lifestyle, and then enthusiastically adopting phrases like, I'm really into, for the things you love.
You're finding your people.
Exactly. You are actively curating your social circle. You are finding the people who share your specific cadence.
Which naturally brings us to the physical manifestation of that cadence.
Yeah.
Our routines are always and are rarely, they inevitably collide with the realities of our physical bodies.
They absolutely do.
And whether we are pushing our limits at the gym or succumbing to exhaustion, the vocabulary we use to describe our physical state is incredibly precise.
Precision is mandatory here because the body's sensations dictate our capacity to participate in society. Let's look at the concept of pain as detailed in the sources.
Okay, let's do it.
There is a very rigid line drawn between different types of physical discomfort based on origin. If you lift heavy weights or you run a marathon, your muscles are sore.
Right, and soreness is almost treated as a virtue. It's like the currency of effort.
Exactly. It implies agency.
Yeah.
You chose the activity that caused the soreness. But if you contract a virus, your whole body aches.
It aches. Yeah, totally different vibe.
It's a passive, pervasive pain. You would never say your body is sore from the flu. The vocabulary strictly separates the pain of productive effort from the pain of victimhood or illness.
That is so subtle, but so true. And the gym culture vocabulary they analyze is fascinating on its own. It's like a highly specialized subdialect.
Oh, completely.
You know, asking someone, can you spot me? Or inquiring about how many sets they have left. But the distinction that really caught my eye was the difference between staying in shape and getting in shape.
The psychological chasm between those two phrases is vast.
It really is. Because if you are staying in shape, you are in a state of maintenance. You possess the fitness, and now you are just paying the daily tax to keep it.
Right.
But getting in shape is entirely aspirational. It's an admission of deficit. You are working toward a future physical state that doesn't currently exist.
And the friction of that aspiration is highly motivating, whereas maintenance, well, that can sometimes become a psychological burden. But this precision isn't just reserved for fitness. It applies equally to systemic failure.
When we get sick.
Yes. When the body breaks down, the language shifts. Navigating the doctor's office, being asked, what brings you in today? Or describing a fever or feeling nauseous. The sources note the casual phrase we use when we first feel illness creeping in. I'm coming down with something.
It perfectly captures the gravity of sickness, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like a literal weight slowly descending on you.
Yeah.
But this is where the source material gets into my absolute favorite territory. Health idioms.
Ah, yes.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because I look at idioms like secret handshakes or like encrypted data.
Encrypted data, how so?
Well, think about a phrase like fit as a fiddle. If you decode it literally, it makes absolutely zero sense.
True.
Why would a violin be the ultimate standard for peak human physical condition? It's absurd.
Yeah.
But if you can casually drop fit as a fiddle into a conversation, you are proving that you are in the club. You possess the decryption key for that culture.
You're demonstrating cultural fluency, not just grammatical competence.
Exactly. You are showing that you run on the same linguistic operating system as a native speaker.
Idioms like feeling under the weather to denote illness, which obviously has nothing to do with meteorology, or working up a sweat or hitting the gym, they all operate on that same encrypted level.
But the one that really demands unpacking is running out of steam. We use this when we lose all our energy, right? Whether we are at the gym or just mentally exhausted at work.
That idiom is deeply revealing of our societal operating system. The imagery explicitly compares the human body to a 19th century industrial machine, a steam engine.
Right. We talk about ourselves as if we are mechanical assets that require fuel to keep producing output. And when we fail, it's not that we've experienced a biological need for rest, it's that we've suffered a mechanical failure. We've run dry.
It reveals how thoroughly industrialized our concept of health has become. We view our physical well-being through the lens of productivity and mechanical efficiency. We don't just exist, we operate.
Which makes me wonder if that idiom is already becoming obsolete. Like, as we shift from an industrial society to a digital one, are we going to stop saying we ran out of steam and start saying I don't have the bandwidth?
Oh, we already are. The metaphors are updating to reflect our new technological reality. But the underlying premise that the body is a tool for output, that remains exactly the same.
But our bodies and our identities aren't just static tools, right? They evolve.
Yeah.
And the final section of our deep dive looks at how we use this linguistic architecture to essentially time travel.
Time travel.
Yeah, we've mapped out the present, but language allows us to look back at who we were and project who we want to become.
The primary vehicle for reflecting on the past in English is the phrase, used to. The sources use the example, I used to be shy, but now I'm confident.
It's basically a linguistic graveyard for past selves.
That's a stark way to put it, but it's accurate. Used to creates a definitive boundary. It acknowledges a past reality that is entirely closed, juxtaposing it against a new, realized present. It is the specific grammatical structure of personal growth and evolution.
And once you have established that you are capable of transformation, you turn your attention forward. What struck me in the sources was the deliberate escalation of desire when articulating the future.
The escalation, right?
It starts with a simple preference. I want to. Like, I want to run a marathon.
And a want is just a stated desire. It carries very little psychological weight.
Right. But then it escalates to, I hope to run a marathon. It adds a layer of vulnerability, acknowledging that the outcome isn't entirely in your control. Then you cross a threshold into structure. My goal is to.
And a goal requires architecture.
Yeah.
If you say, my goal is to, you are implying to the listener that you have a methodology, you have a timeline, a system.
But the absolute peak of this escalation is, my dream is to. The sources use the example, my dream is to live abroad. And notice how the stakes completely change.
Oh, totally.
If you fail to achieve a want or a goal, it's a practical setback. But if you fail to achieve a dream, it's an existential blow.
Yeah.
A dream is woven into your core identity.
And this is where the language of fitness and the language of life goals beautifully intersect in the source material. Navigating the space between where you are and that ultimate dream requires specific cognitive tools, which take the form of mantras.
Like, consistency is key, or every step counts.
Exactly. But the one that dominates modern goal setting is progress, not perfection.
It's everywhere.
It is.
But I want to move past the cliche of it. So what does this all mean? Let's analyze it structurally. Why does a phrase like progress, not perfection, actually alter a learner's mindset?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, look at the syntax itself. There are no verbs in that phrase.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Consistency is key as a verb, is. But progress, not perfection, is a verbless absolute. By stripping away the action, it presents itself not as a suggestion, but as a universal law of nature.
Wow, that is fascinating. It sounds less like advice and more like a mathematical equation.
Exactly. And psychologically, human beings are so easily paralyzed by the gap between their current reality and their idealized dream, the perfection. This verbless maxim fundamentally shifts the metric of success. It removes the paralyzing expectation of flawlessness and replaces it with the sole requirement of momentum. It forgives failure so long as the trajectory remains forward. That is the ultimate takeaway, whether you're trying to learn new language, build muscle, or just improve your daily routine. Linguistic framing is the key to success.
It literally changes how you score your own life. And man, what a journey we've taken through that life today. We started at the absolute foundational building blocks, how the compression of a single syllable in your name can project warmth instead of robotic stiffness.
Right, from I am to I'm.
We examined how we audit our values through the performative use of routines, and how we use gentle deflections to politely decline hobbies and curate our communities.
We looked at the encrypted cultural data hidden in our idioms, surviving the gym, and the industrial metaphors we use to describe our physical limitations.
And finally, we saw how we build linguistic graveyards for our past selves so we can articulate the architecture of our biggest future dreams.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. And the biggest takeaway here, and I want you to really internalize this the next time you are studying a topic, whether it's the syntax of a new language, the mechanics of fitness, or something else entirely, is that you are never just memorizing facts.
No, never.
You are building a toolbox for self-expression. Every nuance you master gives you a more precise instrument to bridge the gap between your internal reality and the external world.
It is the lifelong process of ensuring that when you introduce yourself, you are understood exactly as you intend to be. Which leads to a final provocative thought I want to leave you with today.
Oh, I love these. Let's hear it.
We've spent this entire deep dive exploring how the specific words we have access to shape the way we express our goals and identities.
Right, our linguistic operating system.
Precisely. So consider this. If you were forced to articulate your ultimate, most deeply held dream for the future in a completely different language, one with different idioms, different cultural metaphors, and different ways of expressing time, would the dream itself fundamentally change based on the words you have available to describe it?
Oh, wow. That is an incredible concept to chew on. Does the boundary of our language set the boundary of our ambition? We're going to leave you to ponder that one on your own. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.
Keep questioning the words you choose, and we will see you next time.